Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We are going to get started in about a minute. Is the volume better now?
Works for me.
How about now? Any feedback?
Victoria, that sounds much better right there.
Perfect, thanks.
Fine.
We will just wait another minute for the rest of the participants to join. All right, so we will get started here. I am Victoria Ballestero. I am a site civil engineer with ATCS. I manage our Prince George's County office in Largo, Maryland, right across from the University of Maryland Medical Center. I am also a board member for MBIA, and I'm really pleased to be here today to kick off our second presentation for the Lunchtime Land Development Series with David Thaler. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started for everybody on the phone. If you are planning on earning credits for this class, you will need to have your camera on for the duration of the class, and Carrie and Becky and other folks from MBIA will be checking periodically to make sure folks' cameras are on. Again, that's only for people who are looking to get PE, LS, or LA credits for professional development hours. In addition, please make sure that your name on your Zoom account is something that's meaningful, namely your first and last name. If you're not sure how to change your name, you can drop a message in the chat box, which is at the bottom of the screen, and Carrie can help you to rename yourself. As a reminder, this session will be recorded, and we are already recording. So if you're in witness protection, please exit the recording. One last item here. For optimal viewing, we strongly recommend that you do a shared screen mode. At the top right-hand corner of your screen, you should be able to click on view, and you should have three options. One is standard, one is side-by-side speaker, and one is side-by-side gallery. I would strongly recommend moving into the side-by-side speaker mode so that you'll see David as he's presenting adjacent to his PowerPoint presentation. Last bit of housekeeping here. We will be doing questions at the end of the presentation. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to drop them in the chat box and I'll read them aloud to the group. Otherwise, at the end of the presentation, feel free to just turn your microphone off and we will move forward from there. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's presenter, David Thaler. In 2019, David Thaler won the award as the top professional engineer in the United States. He is the managing principal of DS Thaler & Associates, a civil and environmental engineering firm that he founded in 1976. He is a fellow of the NSPE, ASCE, and the Royal Geographical Society in London. He's a board-certified diplomate of both the National Academy of Forensic Engineering and the American Academy of Water Resources Engineering. He has received multiple Lifetime Achievement Awards and holds Maryland's highest military honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, as well as the Militia Medal with Bronze Star. He is involved with projects of extraordinary complexity, and his firm has designed more than 4,300 land development assignments throughout the Mid-Atlantic. He invented super silt fence, among other innovative land development techniques. He has published more than 250 articles and 5 books on a wide variety of subjects, and has lectured at more than a dozen colleges and universities, including the University of Baltimore School of Law, where he was a visiting scholar. Without further ado, I'd like to present David Thaler.
Well, thank you so very much for that very kind introduction, Victoria. My mother would have been so proud. Sorry she can't be here today to see it. Welcome everybody on this very beautiful day to the second in our series on land development. And this is sponsored by MBIA and the Land Development Council. And I want to talk a little bit about today as an orientation to land development and what land developers do and how they do it. So what is it that land developers do? I remember kind of vividly a time when you could walk into the county office building with a raw piece of property and walk out with a permit to develop. But that's not the case anymore. Today, land is a highly regulated business. And even though home building has become dominated by the national merchant builders, land development is extremely local. And that provides really an opportunity for all of us. So what a land developer does in general is locates, ties up and buys land, obtains the necessary entitlements and approvals, usually subdivides the land, sometimes builds a project infrastructure, creating finished lots, and finally sells the lots to the builders. Developers source land deals from GIS, land brokers, and real estate agents, property owners, and very often from their engineers. In fact, most often sometimes. Now, with a property under contract, developers use a team of consultants to create a development plan to get the governmental approvals. And once the development plan is approved, the property is then subdivided usually by creating a final plat of subdivision called a record plat. And depending on the developer's expertise, financing, experience, and appetite for risk, they may sell lots at a record plat, or they may grade the site, developing it, installing the water, the sewer, the roadways, and creating finished lots for a home builder to buy. Now, one entity, back in the day, one entity would do all of this, but that's pretty rare anymore. And the land development process can now be thought of as a spectrum of opportunity, ranging from raw land to improved land. Raw land refers to virgin, untouched ground with no approvals from any regulatory agencies. Preliminary approved land is the next level along the spectrum and refers to land which has an initial level of approval, usually from a planning board or planning commission. And those plans are typically called a development plan or a preliminary plan, or sometimes a site development plan. The next level along the spectrum of opportunity is subdivided and approved property, which refers to property which has a recorded final plat of subdivision, a record plat. It is generally illegal to sell subdivided lots before a record plat has been approved and recorded. Some jurisdictions allow plats to be recorded without final engineering being approved, but most do not. When all site engineering, including stormwater management, grading, erosion and sediment control, water and sewer, and roadways are designed and permits obtained, the property is commonly referred to as entitled or shovel-ready. Next along our spectrum are developed lots, which refers to lots for which the necessary improvements, including streets and utilities, have been installed, but where there has not yet been construction of buildings. And finally, there is improved property for which buildings have been constructed. Now, improved property can be further subdivided into categories of distressed property in the case of commercial. It could be run down or not leased, and property in good condition. Now, if an investor wants to purchase property, say a house or maybe a 7-Eleven with an existing lease on it, and if he does a reasonable due diligence, a home inspection, termite inspection, a check for building code violations, covenants, and restrictions, there's little likelihood that the property cannot be used for its intended purpose. As you might expect, the level of risk correlates to the level of reward. Because the uncertainty in raw land is so very high, its rewards can also be very high as well. And conversely, the return on improved property in good condition is comparatively lower. Each step along the development approval process reduces the risk and increases the certainty, but it also reduces return. Home buyers are the purchasers of the lowest level risk, and they have the lowest level reward. If you buy a house in good condition and turn around and sell it immediately without adding any value, it's very likely you're going to get much of a return. But home builders lay in the middle of the risk and reward spectrum, and developers tackle the highest risk part of the industry while also having the opportunity to reap the highest rewards. Now, if you've ever listened to a talk by Ed Gold, you would have heard him state that what home builders are looking for is certainty, and they're willing to pay for it. The price that home builders are willing to pay is inversely proportional to risk. Where there is a low level of risk, as in properties ready to go, a home builder will pay a much higher price than if there's a high level of risk. Now, understanding that land development is inherently risky, it seems as though the benefits would have to far outweigh the gamble of a land deal gone awry. So what makes developers tick? What is the great incentive behind raw land development of all the opportunities available to us within the spectrum of development? Its benefits, frankly, can be tremendous. First of all, there are often very high returns. We will review the performance of an actual project that our office did to quantify the return, but first a quick question. What has more value, a 10-carat diamond or 10 1-carat diamonds? Well, the answer, of course, is the 10-carat diamond because of its rarity. I'd much rather have a 10-carat diamond than 10 1-carat diamonds. But with land, which has more value, 1 10-acre lot or 10 1-acre lots. And it's exactly the opposite as it is with diamonds. The answer is 10 1-acre lots. If a 1-acre lot is worth $100,000, the first acre of the 10-acre lot might be worth that $100,000. The second might be worth $50,000. The third acre might be worth $25,000 and $12,500 perhaps for each acre thereafter. And so value is created in the process of subdivision. Now, of course, this is to a large extent what has driven the subdivision of property since colonial times. Charles II gave the province of Maryland to George Calvert and his descendants as a business proposition. That's not often understood. And Calvert subdivided and sold parcels and was subdivided again and again. It's a good thing he didn't have to go through the county approval process, or we'd still be a colony, I think. And I call this creation of value by the subdivision of land fission, much like nuclear fission, because monetary value is generated through the subdividing of land, and that's really what drives our industry. So let me give an example. I'm going to do a case study here, both an entitlement case study and a land development a case study. Now, normally I would do this at the end of our talk, but I want to do it now because I want to make a point as to the way returns are inversely proportional to risk. But the example I want to use is a property right around the corner from our office in Woodlawn, Maryland. It's on Dogwood Road, just west of Rolling Road and east of the Patapsco River. Now, this property, we actually did it a couple of years ago. It's constructed now and occupied. This is a real example. It contains about 13.5 gross acres, and it's zoned DR 5.5, which in Baltimore County allows 5.5 units to the acre. Public water and sewer are available, but the site sits too low to utilize sewer by gravity. Now, it was an old country club, and you can sort of see it here, which had a pool house and a pool and various ball fields and a clubhouse on it. Kyle, go to the left where it says site. Now, this is a very flat area. I'm going to come back to this. It's suspiciously so, and it didn't smell right to me. It's a soccer field shown right now, but it didn't feel right and would ultimately cause development problems we'll talk about in a bit. It felt to me as if it had been filled, and indeed it had. Now, the site had little community opposition, and when forest conservation, open space requirements, environmental buffers, and all the other development restrictions and requirements were accounted for, we were able to achieve approval of 59 townhouses. Now, the 4-bedroom rental townhouses were ultimately constructed and opened to residents in 2019. And unbelievably, there were 1,200 people on the initial waiting list. And these were rentals. We're going to do our example as if they were for sale and if we were the developer. So let's go to the next one, Kyle. Okay, so let me run what I call an entitlement pro forma here to show you this is not made up. This is a real example. So let's assume that the property could be bought raw for $1 million. And let's assume it yielded 59 lots, and let's assume we're going to do this for cash. So there is no bank loan and there is no financing charge associated with the property. Next line down, let's assume that there's an initial deposit with the sales contract of $50,000. That's 5%. 5 to 10% would be very typical. We need to do an environmental, now this is a simplified pro forma. We could go into much greater detail, but this is basically for real and what you could expect. We need to do an environmental assessment to see if we have wetlands, forest conservation, stream buffers, and especially in this case, toxic and hazardous waste. And so we figure that's about $10,000. We'll need a lawyer to get through the process. We're figuring that's $20,000. And the engineering to get from raw land to fully entitled, everything approved, is about $150,000. Now that's about $3,000 a unit for a townhouse, simple townhouse, which would not be atypical here. In the DC area, you would expect to find prices much more than that. $10,000 for county fees. And so the total entitlement expense is $240,000. Now it's shovel ready, ready to go, has all its permits. And this could be sold to a national builder for something on the order of $2 million. Now over in the very far right, you'll notice I figured this out per lot. So the raw land price would be $16,949 on a per lot basis to tie up the property. The entitlement is $4,149 per lot, and the sales price at record is $33,898. Not atypical at all for a recorded townhouse lot. So let's continue through our pro forma. We're going to sell for $2 million to a national home builder. The land cost we subtract is $950,000. $50,000 of the price has already been paid as the deposit. Closing costs should be about 4% or $40,000. And the entitlement cost, which we figured above, is $240,000, which yields a profit of $770,000. Now we've done this for cash, and we put in $240,000, and so our return is 321%. Here, you see it, Kyle, you see at the bottom, is 321%. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm getting about 10 basis points on my CDs right now, and 321% sounds pretty good. But let's see what it would be. Let's suppose I didn't have the $240,000, and let's suppose we did it with a bank loan. So, and let's assume that we borrowed half of it. Now, probably we'd have to sign for it and provide collateral, but let's assume we borrowed $120,000. Now, the only change to the cost is their now interest expense. And that'll come out to $4,800. You need to go back. You need to go back one. And that'll go in the bank loan column, Kyle. It's $4,800. And I'm just assuming it's a 4% a bank loan for 1 year to make it simple. And so our cost only goes up by the $4,800 dollars of interest. And our profit is a little less, $765,200. But because our capital invested is only $120,000, our return goes up to 613%, the bottom line, 613% with a profit of almost $13,000 a unit. Now, these are real numbers. These are numbers any of us could do. I don't know that everybody has either $120,000 or $240,000 sitting around, but there's always your brother-in-law. And you could probably raise it. And with just the knowledge that all of us in this industry have on a $240,000 or $120,000 investment, we could earn about $750,000. Not bad. Okay, well, so why is the return so high? Well, the return is so high because the risk is so high. And I'm going to tell you how to mitigate risk in just a little bit. But the returns in what we do, which is entitling land, are very high. But let's sort of, for the fun of it, let's go to the next step. Suppose we want to actually develop the property. Now I've switched here to per unit prices, but let's do it as if we were the true developer here. So the purchase price, we're a developer, we're going to buy the fully entitled property at $33,898 a lot. Our development costs, now we could make this much more complicated, but I'm just simplifying it, $55,000 a unit, which would include grading, sediment control, stormwater, roads, water, drains, stormwater management, all that, a very typical number around here for a subtotal of about $89,000. Now, these are big numbers, okay? If it's $33,000 a lot times 59, you're talking about really big numbers. So we would certainly want to borrow these costs. And that's one of the miracles, sort of the real estate industry. So you could typically borrow about 60% of the recorded of the value of the recorded subdivision, and you could typically borrow about 70% of the development costs from a number of the banks that are in this particular business. We figure out the amount borrowed. We figure out the interest, which I'm again assuming is 1 year at 4%, and then we figure out what our cash investment is. And our cash investment turns out to be $30,000 a unit. Now, going over to Kyle, go over to the far left column with me. So our development costs all in are now $91,252, but our sales price to developed lots to the national merchant builders are $140,000. Very typical a sales price for townhouses in this area. We subtract the cost of $91,000 and we come up with a profit of $48,748, or go to the right, Kyle, or a profit of $2,876,000. But we've had to get this profit, that's really nice. We've had to invest of our own money $1,773,493, which yields a return of 162%. Now, in the prior example, this is exactly the point I want to make. As the risk goes down, here we have on our spectrum developed a property that we're selling. We can make really good money here, but as the risk goes down, the return goes down. And the returns in our entitlement example, really all we did was get signatures on a piece of paper for a full cash deal was 321%. But here, if we lay out of our own money, $1.7 million, our return is down to 162%. So this is the illustration of how return and risk are inversely proportional. Now, a number of us may be able to raise $240,000 as in the prior example, but raising $1,773,000 is a lot more difficult. But there are ways of financing this. It would be very typical to bring in partners. And there are plenty of partners around and joint venturers who would put up the cash investment for 50% of the deal. And they would be making something like 162%. Other investments, they might only, T-bills or CDs might be making less than 1%. And so that would be very attractive to them. And another way of financing this is the national merchant builders will very often put up a cash deposit that the developer can use to pay some or all of this cash investment. And so the point I want to make is this is a real, I want to make several points on this that I'll cover momentarily, but these are real examples. And it shows how the return, while still very healthy, goes down as the amount of risk goes down and the amount of uncertainty goes up. And it really shows how easy this really is to be in the entitlement business if we can raise basically enough money to put a deposit down and hire an engineer and a lawyer. We can really get very fine returns on our money. Kyle, go to slide 12. So the second benefit of being a land developer is leverage. Okay, the American system of real estate finance is really the finest in the world, and I have done some work in Europe. And if an investor wanted to start another business, the only collateral would be his signature and net worth, which is often inadequate. However, in real estate, as we just saw in the prior example, almost uniquely, the property itself serves as collateral, and in many cases, 50 to 80% of the value of the property can be borrowed. Now, back in the day, which I remember well, when Jeffrey Levitt was around, it was not unheard of to be able to borrow 110% of the value of the property, but he went to jail and those days are long gone. Now, a final benefit of land development is really it's easy. To be a land developer, you don't need a big overhead, you don't need a big office, and you don't need much of a staff, if any. And of course, there are land development firms that are quite large. It's quite possible to be a land developer while working from home and in your basement, and many do. Now, while some of the best land developers I know have engineering backgrounds, they typically hire engineering firms for the heavy lifting. Certainly, our group of engineers, planners, and surveyors aren't the only team member a developer engages, because a variety of talents are typically required from professionals of various disciplines. But in its very simplest form, a developer only needs the skills of an engineer and a friendly banker or investor. Now, other required professionals could include landscape architects, environmental consultants, structural engineers, geotechnical engineers, archaeologists, historians, and lawyers, all of whom are generally available for hire on a contract basis in most jurisdictions. And with knowledge and capital, almost anyone can develop land. And in the case of entitlement, almost unbelievably, you never have to close on the property in many cases. An investor can take an option, pay a deposit, hire an engineer to prepare the necessary documentation, record a plat, and flip the property to a developer or builder without ever settling on it. And so without moving a single cubic yard of earth, a developer can yield quite a tidy return. But the reason the returns are so high, is of course that this is a very risky business. Development is inherently risky, and in order to be successful, it's important to understand and manage that risk. Now, for those who joined the first presentation in our series, you'll recall what I like to call Thaler's Law of Black Swans. It was Donald Rumsfeld, the former Secretary of Defense, who memorably said, there are three types of risks: knowns, unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And unknown unknowns are those you don't know. There's actually a technical difference between risk and uncertainty. Risks are unknowns that have a measurable probability. And what is the statistical probability that the county will approve my project, for example? You can probably calculate that based on past performance. But unknown unknowns are things that we can't anticipate happening. What is the likelihood of something happening that never occurred before? The Ellicott City moratorium, impact fees in Baltimore County, COVID-19, aliens landing. And so managing risk is the first key to being successful, not only, of course, in land development, but probably in all business. But the very first principle to manage risk and keep you out of trouble is to know the rules. I cannot emphasize this enough. One of the principal elements of success in any enterprise is to know the rules. And in the entitlement area, I would know them better than the agency reviewers. Although they're very helpful and well-intentioned, often agency reviewers don't have as much experience in the business as we do and may often give the wrong answer. Now, the second technique to managing risk in our world is to have a proper team. Development is local. A lot of the rules and practices are not written down at all, and it is important to have a local engineer and attorney who are familiar both with the rules and their interpretation. And it's, the zoning codes, are massive, loose leaf documents, and the most important elements in them often are the interpretations that aren't written down. And it's really important to get somebody who knows the players and knows how the procedures actually work. And finally, the next technique to manage risk is the feasibility study. I can't emphasize this enough. One should always undertake a due diligence process prior to purchasing property. I've had many horror stories from clients who have bought properties at auction and been in for terrible surprises. Feasibility studies are not particularly expensive. Don't be one of those clients who has a terrible surprise. And then finally, perhaps the most powerful tool to manage risk, which we will discuss in greater detail in our next lunchtime webinar, is the option contract. Now, sometimes option contracts don't look like options. They look like contingent contracts. That is, you're required to close when certain contingencies are fulfilled. But in truth, they're really options that allow you to back out if the conditions that you expect to be associated with the property turn out not to be true. Now, let's talk about the site analysis process as it affects the purchase of a property. Now, these typically include four basic elements, which I like to think of as sets of constraints. Now, this is the analysis of the existing conditions of the site itself and its natural resources, analysis of the market with respect to what you hope to use the property for, a financial analysis, and a political analysis. And so again, I like to think of these as constraints or sets of constraints that affect property: physical, financial, market, and political. And what one is looking for is a solution that satisfies all of them, an intersection where a property can successfully satisfy all four sets of constraints. Now, the intersection of physical constraints and financial constraints is cost. Now, for instance, Marlboro Clay on a Prince George's County site is a physical constraint that raises an immediate red flag. It triggers additional geotechnical investigation, and depending on its location and extent, in relation to the developable area of the property, it may require remediation. Now, while Marlboro Clay in and of itself does not necessarily kill a deal, the costs associated with it can seriously affect the viability of development. And it's important to figure this out before you go hard on the property and not afterwards. The intersection between financial constraints and market considerations is revenue and profitability. And if development costs exceed the potential selling price of a home, or if there's market saturation of a particular product type, which renders demand insufficient, the intersection of financial and market constraints will be a no-go. Now, the intersection between physical constraints and political constraints is regulation. This is where there's a little bit of control in the development process, and presumably a developer has engaged knowledgeable local consultants and counsel that can advise on the regulatory climate of a particular jurisdiction. Two relevant examples that fall into this sets of concern are the implications of the Anne Arundel County Forest Conservation Bill that was fiercely contested last year, and the impending change of the Prince George's County Comprehensive Map Amendment and Zoning Ordinance rewrite expected to be finalized probably sometime this summer. And the last intersection, the intersection of political and market constraints, lies the greatest area of uncontrollable risk. These external factors cannot be predictably influenced, and the key is to gain as much certainty as possible during feasibility and due diligence so that a deal can weather the political and market tides. Two things that bear noting. The first is what you're trying to do is find an intersection that works for all of these, and sometimes there is no intersection. You can't get all four sets of constraints to work, and those deals you should walk away from. Perhaps the second point I would make is a problem is not a problem if you find it in feasibility. If you find it in feasibility, it's the seller's problem, and the seller is like the termite. It's like a termite inspection. If you find the termites before you buy the house, the seller has to fix them. But if you find them after you own the house, it's your problem. The important point to make is find out these problems before you buy the property. Next one, Kyle. Now, these sets of constraints provide a framework for analyzing the viability of a potential project. Of course, you should always analyze the potential market, and most builders would tell you that the quality of the schools and the distance to jobs are the most important elements in a successful project. But who are your buyers? What can they afford? What's the demand and what's the supply? Importantly, what other projects are already in the pipeline? Market studies can be commissioned from outside vendors, particularly Zonda, that will provide guidance on many of these questions. Now, needless to say, always run a pro forma, just sort of I did as a simplified example. What are the land costs? What will it cost to procure the necessary approvals and entitlements? What are the development costs? What kind of loan can you get, and what are the fees? Then we come to analyzing the site itself, beginning with the existing conditions, which we will go into much greater depth in part of next week's talk. But these include topography, boundary, environmental issues, and of course, and perhaps most fundamentally, the zoning. Understanding the political climate of the county and the area you're working in is also vital to a successful project. Meeting with approval agencies, council members, and the community to understand the hot button issues in advance of beginning the process is often critical to success. So where does the process break down? Typically, it's regulations that are excessive or poorly understood, exactions, misjudgments about the marketplace, and of course, political and community opposition. Which we find all over the place today. This is typically based upon arguments about too much traffic and an asserted change in the character of the neighborhood. It would be very naive, I think, not to recognize that there is often a racial and economic undertone to community opposition. Sometimes it's pretty subtle, often not so. Now, I want to talk about some of the basic regulations that apply to land development. I used to say that there are two great bodies of law that apply to land development, but in fact, there are three. The primary public land use control is zoning, of course, which was established by a standard state zoning enabling act, which was a model ordinance published by the Department of Commerce in 1922. There are also, so we have zoning, one great body of law. We will really dig deeply into this in the fourth in our lunchtime series. We also have a standard city planning enabling act published in 1928, which really laid out the subdivision and ultimately the development process. And these are two great bodies of law that have affected us for much of the 20th century. But there's really a third body of law that has crept in over the last 30 years or so, and that is state land use control. Maryland is considered a strong county state, and it does not have very many municipalities, and the counties are large and politically powerful, unlike in Pennsylvania, which has 958 boroughs, 1,546 townships, and 56 cities. And it's considered to be a weak county state, and land use controls there are largely local. And land use controls consist of government ordinances, codes, and permit requirements that restrict the private use of land and natural resources to conform to public policies. However, over time, state authority has asserted itself. Perhaps the first state regulation was the Economic Growth, Research Protection, and Planning Act of 1992, which required the counties to adopt comprehensive plan. But then Maryland has adopted certain statewide environmental regulations, which include tidal wetlands, non-tidal wetlands, forests and forest conservation, Chesapeake Bay, a critical area. And in 2012, Maryland adopted the Sustainable Growth and Agricultural the Sustainable Growth and Agricultural Preservation Act, which limited development activity using on-site septic systems in rural and agricultural areas of the state. It divided the state into various tiers, and tier 4, Roman numeral 4, was the rural and agricultural area, which was limited to not more than 7 lots or 3 lots in the case of Baltimore County, no matter how large the property. Baltimore County, under this act, you could have a 1,000-acre property and only get 3 lots out of it maximum. In 1997, the legislature passed the Priority Funding Areas Act, which defined priority funding areas and basically, with few exceptions, prohibited the state from providing funding for growth-related projects such as the extension of sewer lines, transportation improvements, or schools outside of the designated priority funding areas. And finally, as a result of Terrapin Run, a project in Western Maryland in Allegheny County, in 2016, the legislature passed the Smart Green Growing Plan Consistency legislation of 2009, which essentially required zoning to be in conformance with county master plans. Master plans are generally considered to be guides. Zoning is generally considered to be something specific that you have to apply to a specific property. But once this law was passed and that development had to be consistent with master plans as well, it created lots of problems because of the inconsistencies between the zoning and the master plans. But in any event, the state has become a major player in land use control. an area that has traditionally been under the control of the counties. In addition to zoning, subdivision, and state land use control, it's worth noting there's several other types of land use regulations, which I'm sure many of you and many of us are familiar with, including building codes, housing codes, historic preservation, to name but a few. Zoning and subdivision, however, are the land use controls that most affect the land developer, and so understanding zoning and its origin are a key to successfully assessing a site's viability for development. Now, zoning came on the scene in America rather suddenly in 1916, but it's important to understand where it came from, because the elements of the earliest zoning ordinance, the very first, the 1916 New York City ordinance, are still with us. Here, for example, is an excerpt from the Prince George's County zoning ordinance. This is section 27107, the purposes of the ordinance. And in most Maryland jurisdictions, you can find similar language, which also appears on the webpage of the Baltimore City Board of Municipal and Zoning Appeals. Now, the general goals of the Baltimore City Board are the prevention of overcrowding of land, prevention and undue concentration of population, provision of adequate light and air, securing safety from fire, panic, that's a strange word, panic, and other dangers, reduction of congestion in streets, provision for adequate transportation, et cetera. Now, doesn't it strike you as odd, as it does me, that in 2021, in a city that is losing roughly 9,000 residents a year, Baltimore City, when I grew up there, was about 960,000 residents. Today, it's probably under 600,000. But in this, in a city that is losing population so quickly, the Board of Municipal and Zoning Appeals wants to avoid, quote, the overcrowding of land and the undue concentration of population. And do you ever wonder why it also wants to secure safety from panic? Well, here's why. In 1915, Colonel Thomas Coleman DuPont started construction of the Equitable Building at 120 Broadway in New York City. It was colossal for its time, still is. It contained 1.2 million square feet and 16,000 employees who work there every day. And it cast a shadow blocks uptown and created virtual panic, hysteria about what might happen if a fire disgorges thousands of employees onto the narrow streets of New York. Rather far-fetched concern, at least till 9/11. And improbably, the solution was zoning. And here's the preamble from the 1916 New York City zoning ordinance: to lessen congestion in streets, to prevent overcrowding of land, exactly the same as Baltimore City more than 100 years later, exactly the same as section 502.1 of Baltimore County or in Prince George's County. Now, zoning spread quickly across the country and was adopted in nearly every jurisdiction by the mid-1940s, with the notable exception of Houston. Now, why is it called Euclidean? Euclid is a town just east of Cleveland, which was concerned about the spread of industrial uses along the then fancy residential street, Euclid Avenue. And so it adopted a zoning ordinance modeled directly on the New York City 1916 ordinance. And this is the original zoning map of Euclid from 1922. It's a very complicated zoning map with 6 classes of uses and area classifications and height classification. Somewhat surprisingly, this went to the Supreme Court, Town of Euclid v. Ambler Realty, or somewhat surprisingly, it was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1926, upholding what we now call Euclidean zoning. And had the Supreme Court not done that, the American landscape would have looked much different. So what are the elements? Next one, Kyle. So what are the elements of Euclidean zoning? First, a particular use is either permitted or not, and there are a list of uses as of right, and to be allowed, a particular use must be specifically included. There are also special exceptions, usually known as conditional uses, which are other uses that are permitted if a specific set of requirements is met. There's always a provision to control density or intensity, and this is generally done in one of two ways. Baltimore County uses what they call density residential, where you take the gross area multiplied by the permitted density, and that gives you your allowable density. Most other jurisdictions control density by minimum lot size, and property might be zoned, say, R10,000, and each lot would have to contain 10,000 square feet. In commercial zones, intensity is generally controlled by floor area ratio, which is the permitted floor area divided by the area of the lot. In Euclidean zoning, there are also bulk requirements, which include setbacks, height restrictions, minimum yard areas. And finally, for zoning to be constitutional, it must allow for variances to account for special hardships. And in Maryland, variances are strictly controlled, and the seminal case is Cromwell v. Ward, which was a case about a townhouse in Rogers Forge over in Baltimore County. And variances to be granted must meet a two-prong test. First of all, it must be unique, and in Roger Forge, where the Kilty company built 1,200 townhouses exactly the same, uniqueness could not be demonstrated, and then there has to be practical difficulty or unreasonable hardship. And Euclidean zoning, where use is the organizing principle, is by far the most popular zoning in the United States. And in fact, about 70% of all zoning is for single-family detached homes. But it is not the only type of zoning. Form-based zoning is more recently developed type of zoning, where form, not use, is the organizing principle. And this has been adopted in many communities across the country, especially in California. Now, form-based zoning derives from the work of the famous Miami-based architect, Andres Duany, and his wife, Elizabeth Plater Zyberg. In fact, HBAM, the forerunner of MBIA, held a groundbreaking conference with the Maryland Institute College of Art and the American Institute of Architects that I had the privilege of moderating. And Andres Duany was the keynote speaker. And he developed the notion of traditional neighborhood design, which has now evolved into what's called new urbanism. And he had the insight that there were design elements which made traditional American towns like Leesburg or Old Town Alexandria so pleasant and livable. And these were elements were basically prohibited by the requirements of Euclidean zoning. I'll go on to the next slide, Kyle. In 1985, they designed the town of Seaside in the panhandle of Florida using the placemaking principles of new urbanism. And this has been tremendously successful, if slightly unworldly. It was the setting for the movie The Truman Show with Jim Carrey. And now 30 years on, it has become much in demand and a very expensive community, selling at much higher levels than the surrounding communities. And the principles of new urbanism have been widely accepted, including here, famously in Kentlands in Montgomery County. Now, in the ensuing years, this concept has evolved into something we now known as form-based zoning, which addresses the relationship between the building facades and the public realm. And it's the form and mass of buildings in relation to one another that count. And a form-based code regulates development in a way that controls building form first and use second. And in order to achieve a particular type of place or built environment, conventional zoning focuses on each private lot and has ignored the private realm. Form-based zoning divides the community in what are known as transects, different districts, based on the character and intensity of land development and the desired land form. Now, these codes have become very popular, and the zoning ordinance recently adopted by Baltimore City a year or two ago is in many ways a form-based code, and we shall see how that works out. We will explore zoning in much more depth in the fourth talk in this series on April 13th. And that talk is called The Crisis in Housing, Understanding and Vanquishing the Ghost of Euclid, or Is It Really a Vampire? I thank you very much for your attention. Victoria, back to you.
This concludes today's presentation on some of the basics of land development process and the background of modern zoning. When we convene for the third lecture in this series next Tuesday, March 30th, David will take a deep dive into answering what's the next step in the land development process once a property has been identified and financial, political, and market constraints have been green-lighted. We will explore in detail the feasibility and due diligence process we use as engineers to help developers determine the viability of developing a site. And so that is all that we have today, folks. We have about 4 minutes left. Does anybody have any questions? Could
Hi,
you ask
Victoria.
David if he will make the slides available?
Sure.
That was a positive from David.
Says yes on email, so I know who wants them.
Yeah, please just send David an email. His address is up on, his email address is up on the screen. Any other questions? So I do have a question, but I think that we'll need Kyle to go back to the slide with the Excel spreadsheet. So in the entitlement example, David, didn't you leave out paying back the bank the $120,000 loan?
One more. Well, that's a good question, but that confuses people, because there in the sort of expense column is the $120,000.
You're in the right spot. Get me back up. Okay. Well, that's a very good question. Kyle, put the cursor on the $120,000. So there in the cost is the money that we're borrowing from the bank. It's $120,000, but that's not a true cost. We're going to borrow $120,000, use it, and then we're going to give it back to the bank. And the cost of that is the interest, maybe any fees that the bank would charge. And let's say you borrowed from me $1,000 at 10%, and you put it in the stock market, and you made some money. You would have to give me back my $1,000, but the cost of that is $100, is not $1,000. So the amount you borrow isn't the cost; it's the interest and fees that you pay on the amount you borrow that we have to include. And interest rates today are essentially zero.
Thank you. And then, on your entitlements example, you didn't include the cost to bond your public works agreement in order to obtain the record plat. Why not?
Well, that's a very insightful question, whoever asked that. Usually, when you get a record plat, the jurisdiction wants you to either pay for everything or bond it or post a letter, some sort of a surety, and that can be fairly expensive to do. But not in Baltimore County. That's one of the great advantages of working in Baltimore County. If you have public water and sewer, in order to get a record plat, there's basically no fee. And you don't have to pay the fee until you actually get ready to install the water and sewer. And that's another process. They use environmental agreements, utility agreements, and right-of-way agreements. So in Baltimore County, other than a very minor recording fee of maybe $35, there is no charge to get a record plat, which is a great advantage over most other jurisdictions. Thank you, whoever that is who picked that up.
So I think that is all of the time that we have today. If anyone else has other questions, please feel free to email David or Carrie, and we can get some answers back over to you. I thank everyone for joining us today, and I really look forward to seeing everyone again when we reconvene next Tuesday at the same time. We'll see you all then for lunch. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David and Victoria.